For those who have dialed in, if you want, you could identify yourself and the city that you're dialing in from. We'll capture that in the chat. Wow, we got somebody from Honolulu, Nevada, Pennsylvania, California. Oregon, wow, Seattle. So this talk story is going to be recorded. So for those who have dialed in, if you want to be visible, you can. Otherwise, you can stay invisible. But the interns are required to show their face. We'll give everyone 2 more minutes, or maybe 3, so we can get them in. One more minute and we can start. Okay, ready? Good evening. For some, an early evening, and for those who are out in Hawaii, a very good morning. I'm Richard Wong. I'm with the 1882 Foundation, Director of Community Programs, which includes our youth programs and initiatives to revitalize Chinatown in Washington, D.C. The 1882 Foundation is located in the heart of Chinatown in our nation's capital. The foundation is a nonprofit, nonpartisan organization approved by the IRS. Our goal is to make the public aware of the history and continuing significance of the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882. While doing so, Stan Liu, one of our co-founders, and Ted Gong, our co-founder and also executive director, began presenting monthly talk stories in 2011. These talk stories were basically an oral history of one story in their own words, sharing them with others. They could be growing up in Chinatown as a youth, or interviewing family members as Asian Americans, or it could be a documentary like the history of the Chinese Community Church, which is now celebrating the 87th year here in Washington, D.C. These talk stories have been presented continuously since 2011, with some months having several talk stories. So the talk story today is about growing up Asian in America. Before we start, I want to give a shout out to the interns of this year. They were critical in producing the 3 recent talk stories, and they are Elizabeth Ann Berry from George Mason, Emily Bernard from American University, Lelaine Chu from, well, she's going to the University of Virginia, Ada Gull going to Duke University, Ian Kung, William and Mary, Helen Leong from American University, Matthew Shin, Georgetown, Andrew Sun, William and Mary, Vincent Yang, Georgetown, Hong Ying Zhou from Boston University, and we have an intern alum, Ellen Fang, who is also the project manager of this talk story. So with the interns this year, I had a goal. During the interview, I told them, in order for you to be interns, you have to meet certain requirements. And those requirements were simply to have fun, learn, contribute, and make lifelong friends. And I believe that to be pretty easy, especially the fun part. However, there was also a measure of success. I wanted to make sure that the interns, as well as myself and the foundation, learned a bit about each other, as well as the content that we were producing. So the measure of success was to make sure that as each day goes along, we become smarter today than the day before. And that's just half the story. The other part is to make sure that the interns get me smarter each day and smarter than the day before. So I can speak for the foundation to say that we both achieved those milestones. We are definitely smarter today than we were yesterday, due in greatly in part to the interns that we have this year. So kudos to the interns. So this particular talk story evolved from an original project definition that I had Ted Gong approve. And that was originally growing up as Asian in today's society, thinking that perhaps there were influences through family, friends, culture, tradition of Asian backgrounds that may influence decisions that you made in the past, will make in the future, or debating on what to do today. And I thought that would have some significance in identifying who we are today. But what do I know? You'll see today in this talk story that my thoughts of this project has morphed into something else. It is being live streamed. It's a panel discussion. It's being moderated by Elizabeth Berry as well as Ellen Feng. And I believe this to be a very dynamic presentation today. So I'm going to turn this over to Ellen and Elizabeth, and you have the floor.
Thanks, Rich. So this group for Talk Story spent the summer discussing lots of issues that related to Asian Americans as a whole, and also how the Asian American youth, or our representation of that, felt about those issues. So we just wanted to share what we were discussing with everyone and sort of get your input. So the first hour or so is going to be me and Elizabeth moderating with a preset list of questions, and then you can feel free to add more questions to the chat as you come up with them, but we will have a dedicated half hour of questions for after our discussion. Okay, so our first topic will be about Asian American politics. And to start off the discussion, let's just talk about the maybe current political climate around Asian Americans, and maybe the model minority stereotype, and how the Asian American youth feel about it today.
I can get us started. I understand talk about the model minority myth specifically. So for background, I guess model minority myth is this thing where Asian Americans are perceived to be the quote unquote model minority in America, in comparison to, I guess, other minority groups such as Blacks, Latinos, etc. Model minority because we are excelling in like academics, SAT scores, and our representation in higher education, things like that. That perception is, in my experiences, still holds very, very true, and especially does affect the youth of Asian Americans, because it perpetuates stereotypes against us that we are either can only be in high level classes, we only can excel in academics, and that anything that is less than that takes away from who we are as Asian Americans and makes us quote unquote less Asian. I think that as time has gone on, though, the model minority myth has been started to be disassembled and like combated against, especially as our generation in particular, I think, realizes the negative effects that the myth has on our generation and the Asian Americans as a whole. And we're hoping to, I guess, change those perceptions as time goes on.
Yeah, thanks for the brief recap about what the model minority is. Does anyone feel comfortable sharing some of the stories where they have encountered the model minority myth? Yeah, Vincent.
So this example of what I felt was the model minority myth actually comes from within the Asian American community itself. I remember in 7th grade, this was the first grade in our school district that had honors and regular classes. So there's a differentiation between people who earned grades that could get into honors classes and people who couldn't. And I remember the first day of school, I actually grew up in a community that had a significant, specifically Chinese American presence. So a lot of my friends who I had gone to school with are Chinese American. And I remember the first day, it's a new school, it's a new set of classes. We're all a little unsure of where to go because, we're still trying to figure out our schedules. And one of my friends is like, hey, if anyone's confused, if anyone who's in honors classes is confused, they should just follow the Asians around. Because it just so happened that my friends and I were all in the same honors classes. And this was from one of my friends. And I didn't really think much of it at the time, but I realize now that it's just as much an example of the myth as someone else, non-Asian, would be saying it, right? Because why would we have to assume that Asian people are high achieving, right? Why do we put that burden on Asian Americans, and what does that make the Asian Americans who aren't in honors classes feel, right? If you're associating stellar academic performance with an entire ethnic identity, I think that kind of unhealthily promotes this kind of expectation for Asian Americans to do well when it's not as much as an expectation for perhaps other communities of people.
And how did that make you feel personally? Did it change your outlook of yourself, and how you interact with people?
I didn't consider it problematic at the time. I just kind of internalized it as like, oh yes, this is who I am. I'm Chinese American, and Chinese Americans in Eagleville or in Methacton School District do well in classes, right? This is kind of the one-to-one association. Like, of course, our honors classes are like 70% Asian American, because why wouldn't they be? Because Asian Americans are high achieving, and of course they do well at academics. And I think um, it's at least maybe subconsciously influenced me to uh, push myself, because I don't think I could have reconciled with academic subpar performance. I remember in 8th grade there was one class where I wasn't in the honors class, and that made me feel so bad. I was like, what am I doing in regular US history when all my Asian American friends are in honors? Right? I felt so like I shouldn't be around these people. I should be around like other Asian Americans, because I'm also Asian American and I also need to do as well as they did. So I guess that's like a pretty tangible example of how that affected me.
Yeah, I think the model minority is it definitely creates this sort of like negative mental health situation, which we'll get into more later. But I got a direct message from Elena saying that it also it's not really reflective of the community, because it only demonstrates sort of the Korean, Chinese, Japanese, East Asian stereotype, and forgets other Asian Americans that are living in other parts of Asia. And so that sort of leads into my next question about how do you think this stereotype affects Asian American politics as a whole?
Well, the
sorry. Go ahead,
Yeah.
Ian, go ahead.
well, the model minority myth did evolve from the yellow peril, inherently foreigner stereotype, and even now, although they've been promoted to the quote unquote model minority, in addition to adding some of that pressure that they feel and might lead to sacrificing social outgoings and in favor for academic performance, it um, it also shows that Asian Americans may not be continue to be received like that in the media. And even though there are more role models for people to eventually stray away from that perception, it's still by and large how people see it.
I think another pretty tangible way to see the way that affects Asian American politics is like when talking about the issue of affirmative action. I feel like model minority and affirmative action in our community is very closely tied together issue. But something I've noticed from my experiences is that there's a difference in perceiving how either good or bad the model minority myth and affirmative actions are between older and younger generations of Asian Americans. From my experiences, typically older Asian Americans tend to think that the model minority myth can be a good thing, and like affirmative action should be disbanded because it does harm our, like, by the numbers, it does hurt Asian American chances of getting into colleges. But there's this division between our generation in particular, where we realize that these things are harmful, and affirmative action is something that is very necessary, and is something that we should be supporting.
So with that said, what is the Asian American political agenda, if there is one?
I think that's a very interesting question, because I don't really think that we can definitively say that there is a unified political message behind which Asian Americans can all uh, uh, band together behind. I think maybe at the very least, increased representation of Asian Americans, just as a general concept, is something that I think every single Asian American uh, can at least support in some way, whether that be in media or politically. I remember growing up, my parents would say that this country doesn't really work for us, and that's because Asian Americans don't want to go into politics. And so as a result, sort of policy issues that uh, would be worth addressing don't ever get brought up because of the sheer disproportionate misrepresentation. Um, specifically with regard to the lack of Asian American politicians or representatives. And I think whatever your political stance may be, I hope that we can all see that if more Asian Americans were to hold office or represent districts or just be more politically active, I think that would at least get our issues into the sort of national discourse, and to be more seriously considered, and so that our issues could finally be addressed in a more effective way.
Vincent, out of curiosity, what are some of those issues?
I think so. We already brought up affirmative action. I think that's a pretty unique issue with regards to Asian Americans. I guess others would be combating stereotypes. So I think like the Stop Asian Hate movement had a lot of grassroots energy. And I believe that the current administration is also kind of taking that into account. They invited over with members of BTS recently, in an effort to sort of like show solidarity with I guess Asians. As for other, I guess like specific policy issues, off the top of my head, I don't really think I can probably answer that. Yeah, political coalition building is also I guess the issue would be maybe a lack of standout issues, right? Like maybe one of the problems is that we are so disconnected from politics in general that we haven't had the time to form necessary discourse to like ascertain which ones really matter. And so maybe political coalition building can be the first step to sort of determining what problems we need to solve.
Yeah, just to jump in, I've taken a class on Asian American politics, so I have a little bit, I have some background knowledge, but according to like survey data done of like that has taken a wide survey questionnaire over across a lot of Asian Americans, some of the issues that Asian Americans really rally behind are like anti-gun laws, or just gun control laws, the environment, and like universal healthcare. So I think but not a lot of people talk about the commonalities between Asian American groups like that many people support those issues. So I think maybe if political organizations could put more like spread the word about more of those policies, that might be another really mobilizing factor in getting Asian Americans to vote.
Yeah, if you don't mind if I jump in real quick, something that I've seen between DC and Hawaii is just the lack of civic engagement, voter registration, just getting involved. And I don't know if that's tied to the whole Asian mentality of not making waves, essentially. That's for Hawaii, but like just not causing anything by raising issues and whatnot. So even just getting people involved, even engaged in conversations that are political in nature outside of the dinner table, I think is a huge barrier to what Vincent was saying, is just trying to get a read on what Asian American issues are out there. And just as an aside, I love dialing into events like this, especially on the East Coast, because living in Hawaii, Asian American issues of stereotype and crime is just not as relevant or even existent here because we are the majority. But I think that's been my personal mission, because I want people here to still pay attention to these happenings and still have a voice and still advocate and whatnot, and not just kind of think it's not related to them. I appreciate this event, but this is the kind of slant that I'm having, or perspective I'm having when I attend conversations like these.
Yeah, and thanks for stopping by and for your participation. We really appreciate it.
Yeah.
So for our next topic, we're actually going to move on to mental health. And this is a prominent discussion that we had during our summer discussions. And so I guess the first question I'd pose to the group is, what would you say to the older generation of Asian Americans? What would you say the older generation's reaction is to mental health?
So, uh, so I would say, I mean, a bit of my background. I'm actually from China, and I was raised and I grew up there. And so I don't think I can speak for like Asian American parents or older generations, but I can talk about like how like things have been in China regarding, you know, mental health issues. So basically, I would say the older generations in China don't really look favorably upon people who suffer from mental illnesses, especially I would say male, because I think there is this macho pride that is so ingrained in the Chinese society that people who, especially, you know, I would say male teenagers who suffer from mental illnesses would be regarded as weak, and they don't really, and because of that, they don't really have the initiative to kind of seek help or, you know, talk to the people from whom they can receive assistance. So I guess, but like I think at this point, you know, as time moves on, people of my generation, they're more active in, you know, seeking help, in getting the help they need. And basically it just but like still there is like some, I would say, generation gap between, you know, the Chinese youth and the older generations, because, you know, like people of the older generations still believe that, you know, people should not show their weaknesses, and so they should just hide their weaknesses when they feel vulnerable, and they're not encouraged to kind of let everybody know that, yeah, I'm just I'm not going to make it. But like I would say, you know, my parents and their generations, I think they're more open in and more tolerant to, you know, to people who do suffer from mental illnesses, and I think that's a promising trend for now. But just you know, in terms of older generation, I still there is still this, you know, very huge misconception that's very I would say ingrained in the Chinese society.
Yeah, in addition to what Hongyang had to say, I would say there's also kind of a widespread just say it maybe is a disbelief in mental illness, as in just like it's not even something that older generations may believe that people experience, which I think is really caused by just a lack of understanding about what mental health and mental illness really is. And I think that's part of where that generational disconnect comes from, is just a lack of open discussion about what mental health and what mental illness is and how and why we experience it. And I think if there was just more discussion and talk about that mental health and mental illness do exist, I think it would create maybe the possibility for to bridge that disconnect between generations.
Right. In addition to what Helen said, I think there's a misconception that the older generation has, that just because you don't talk about the issues, therefore it doesn't exist kind of thing. Once you make it invisible, that's when things kind of disappear, but that's obviously not true. In fact, I remember seeing a statistic that said while Asian Americans reported having fewer mental health conditions than their white counterparts, they're actually more likely to consider an attempt suicide. So this obviously also resorts back to the model minority myth of, if you just tough it up. If you act fine, things will be fine. But I think what the younger generation is doing so much better at is the fact that we're recognizing, we're talking about this more, normalizing having mental health issues, because there's so much stigma around having mental health issues and just simply seeing a therapist. And so I think by having more conversations, like Helen said, and really talking about these issues with peers, with people, normalizing it would definitely be a really good step towards something better for for future generations.
You guys kind of touched on this already, but what do you guys think the root of the stigma around mental health? I know for me within the Black community that, you know, if you got mental health issues, you just go to church. Mental health is not really seen as like a thing. If there's nothing physically wrong with you, then it's not a problem. So like, what would you say is the root for y'all for mental health when it comes to interacting with your families and explaining, I have this issue?
For me personally, it definitely stemmed from the model minority myth, as we've previously discussed, which is the kind of idea that Asian Americans are always high achieving, top of their class, all that. And when I was younger, I really bought into the model minority myth. I wanted to be valedictorian, top of my class. I wanted to go to an Ivy League university. And my whole life, I was just putting this pressure on myself to be the best that I can be in everything that I did. And that pressure kept building and building. And eventually it kind of came to a head. And it was just too much for me to handle. And on top of that, I wanted to be, I like playing into the model minority myth. I wanted to be a good daughter. I didn't want to be a burden to my parents. I didn't want to come off as not perfect. So I just didn't tell anyone I was experiencing these problems, because like I wasn't being a model minority by having them, which is why I like to say the model minority, I think, was really the root, one of the foundations for my mental health issues.
Like also another aspect of it, I think Alina mentioned this in the chat about weakness. There's a lot of pressure on the young generation because most of us are either first or second generation who their parents or grandparents immigrated to America. And there's a lot of pressure that comes from that, where it's like, we can't really feel like we have a right to say that we need help or that there's something wrong with us, because our parents and our grandparents never expressed that they never had mental health issues as far as we know. But they had significantly harder circumstances immigrating to another country, facing a culture shock going from Asia to America, and they were able to deal with it and move on and be successful. So it's this barrier of like, how dare we say that we have issues when we were like born and raised here in America, where we are like have all this opportunity and we have it great compared to them, and we can't really like feel like we have a right to talk about it.
That's a great point, Matt. Do you think any other aspects, or does anyone think of any other aspects about immigration specifically and how that like affects generational trauma? Like, what about immigrating from a foreign country to America, how like sort of creates the environment that like the Asian American youth today would experience mental health problems?
I think just feeling the disconnect between your heritage and what you see around you. We are well aware of the phenomenon as ABC, American Born Chinese, words like banana and stuff like that, where there's such a differential between how you are aware people see you and what your home life is like. If you come to hate your appearance because that's not how you would like to be, that's not how you would best fit in, the heritage becomes more like a curse rather than a part of your tradition that you cherish year in, year out.
Like
Before we
also,
move, Oh, sorry, Matt.
Sorry.
You can go ahead.
Yeah, I also like the pressure that comes from like having immigrant parents or immigrant grandparents is that we can't really escape like the pressure that comes from expecting to have great academic success, because that pressure is coming from both like stereotypes from American society, but then that same pressure is also being applied by your parents because they are expecting you to like, succeed academically because they came to this country and now you have all these opportunities. So it's like it creates this, you can't really escape that environment ever, going from like school life to like home life.
Really good. So before we move on to the next subject, I just wanted to ask this question that was posted in the chat. Where do you let's see. Where do you two express mental stress, and like what about elders too? So I'm assuming it's like, where do you guys you guys have touched on it, but I guess to go in a little bit more, like where do you guys express your mental stress, and like when it comes to dealing with elders as well, if I'm reading that correctly.
I know for me personally, when I have a lot on my mind, I'll usually either talk to my parents or my friends first. That's usually my first step as a way of kind of relieving mental stress, is just talking about what I'm experiencing with people who I know care about me and will listen to me. Um, and as for the part about elders experiencing mental health issues, which I think for sure definitely occurs, but I think as we previously discussed, with these generational gaps and kind of a disconnect about understanding of mental health, I think it's a lot more difficult for Asian American elders to uh, understand that they have options available to them that will help them like relieve themselves of mental stress.
So we'll come back to ask more questions about this topic because it seems like a lot of people in the chat want to talk more about it. But so after many weeks of discussions relating to growing up Asian American, we realized that a lot of issues still come down to how we identify and like what that means to us and what that means to society and how they view our identification. So I just want to go around to all the interns and have them sort of just to say their ethnic identity and national identity. So I'll go first. I am a biracial Asian American. My dad is from Taiwan and my mom is from Montana.
Right, I guess I'll go next. I'm African American. My mom's from DC and my dad's from Jackson, Mississippi.
I'll go next. I consider myself to be Hispanic Chinese American. My mom is a white American, and my dad was born to Cantonese parents in Nicaragua.
I'll go next. I consider myself Chinese and I'm from China. Both of my parents are Chinese.
I'll go next. I'm also biracial, Asian American. My mom is Chinese and my dad's a white American.
I guess I can go next. I consider myself Chinese American. Even though my grandmother is Korean, I don't think I've ever grown up with any sort of Korean cultural heritage. Both my parents immigrated from China, they're first generation immigrants, and so I consider myself Chinese American.
I would also consider myself Chinese American. My dad is from Singapore. My mom is from Taiwan. If you trace it far back enough, though, it's just mainland China.
And then I am Chinese Korean American. My dad immigrated from Seoul, South Korea, and my mom was Chinese American, but she was born and raised in the US.
So as you can see, we got very although it's mostly predominantly East Asian Americans, it's a diverse, everyone's got diverse backgrounds about how they identify. So for those who are bi or multiracial, how do you feel about claiming the Chinese identity? And how have you come to terms with being multiracial?
For me personally, coming to terms with my Chinese identity was very difficult because I was raised in a mostly English speaking household. The only language I'm really fluent in is English. I can speak a little Mandarin. It's not that great. And I can't even speak any Cantonese, which is the language that my grandparents spoke. So it was really difficult for me to consider myself Chinese, also because I don't fit the stereotype of what the majority of people think a Chinese person looks like. So it was hard for me to picture myself as a person who was Chinese. And in addition to not speaking any Chinese languages, we never celebrated Chinese holidays. I didn't really feel like Chinese could be my identity to claim. And then as I got older, I realized that it was okay that I didn't speak any Chinese languages, and it's okay that my family didn't celebrate Chinese holidays, because that still didn't take away the fact that I was Chinese.
That's so interesting because although I share the same sentiments as Helen, I have a very different experience when it comes to still having imposter syndrome, thinking about my identity. So I actually lived in China for 7 years. And so even though I speak the language and even though I still celebrate the holidays and do everything a Chinese person would do, I sometimes still have a hard time really reconciling with that identity because, again, like Helen said, I don't appear as Chinese by first impression. In fact, when I'm in China, I'm still seen as a foreigner because I don't look like them. And so to them, when I speak Chinese, it's a shock, it's a surprise. They just think, oh, it's a white foreigner being able to speak Chinese and not necessarily, oh, she's one of us. And so I think it's really difficult trying to navigate both sides of the aisle when you are biracial or multiracial.
No, and in addition, it reminded me of because, as I said, my dad was born in Nicaragua, so his first language is Spanish. And when I grew up, I didn't have a grandma, I had an abuelita. And one part and something that made it really difficult for me to come to terms with my Chinese identity as well, because I thought I had to pick and choose. I didn't think I could be Chinese, Hispanic, and American all at once. I was so confused as to why did I have an abuelita? Can I have an abuelita and still be Chinese? So with the multiracial aspect kind of coming into play in my life as well, and kind of the intersection of all of these different cultural heritages also made it kind of difficult for me to unite them all, and I felt like I had to single one out. I couldn't be multiple things at once.
Really interesting. So for the ones who fully identify as Chinese, how does this experience compare to yours as being Chinese Americans? What about being Chinese international as well?
I guess I can start as part of the discussion. So as I said, I'm Chinese American. And I believe, to the extent of my knowledge, Chinese Americans are still the largest ethnic group within Asian Americans. And growing up in a community with a lot of Chinese Americans, so I had like a friend group of 8 to 9, maybe 10, just Chinese American kids all my age. Um, I saw myself as like, Chinese American first. I didn't really identify with the Asian American label, because I guess being around so many people of the same ethnicity, just made me feel like more part of that group. But it wasn't simply just being Chinese American. I think growing up, I kind of viewed it as like a gradient. How Chinese are you? Because you are obviously American. You're born in this country, you're growing up in this country, you have a childhood in America, but how Chinese can you be? And so I used measures like, did you go to Chinese school? Did you participate in cultural events? Are you like stuff that's not even directly like related or associated with Chinese, but do you play an instrument? Do you do extracurriculars? Are you an overachiever? All of these things. If you check off all these boxes, you're higher up on the Chinese to American scale. And I think even like proficiency in Mandarin was like the biggest one for me because I thought my friends who were like mostly fluent, okay, they're Chinese American. Me, I'm struggling a little bit. I don't think I can claim a full Chinese identity. And then for those who barely speak Chinese at all, I would consider them as not fully Chinese. I realize now that that's a very, I guess, like unhealthy and unhelpful way of looking at this. I don't think an arbitrary scale of like Chineseness is really the best way to sort of see other Asian Americans. If if you are ethnically Chinese, I believe that's all you kind of need to be considered Chinese American. You don't need to prove to other Chinese American people that just because I do X number of extracurriculars or because I passed the AP Chinese test that I am just as much a Chinese American as you are. So that's like my personal experience growing up, and trying to like grapple with that label.
I mean, so for me, my experience, I mean, as a Chinese international student here, my experience has been, one of, acculturation. So basically, in many aspects of life, I've been trying to kind of make myself like, I would say more American because I've been here for some time and I go to college here. So I just don't want to be like an outsider, right? I wanted to kind of integrate into the local society and the community. And but I think the most of the challenges came from my experience in the classroom. So basically, because like I said before, I received most of my education back in China. I went to public schools there, and like in Chinese public schools, the teachers rewarded some submissiveness and silence. So basically, as long as you listen to the teachers and you just do your work, do the readings, and you score well on the exams, and you're classified as a good student. And basically, you are not encouraged to challenge what the teachers say, and you don't want to ask questions in the classroom because this is just a waste of time, right? The teachers don't have time for every single stupid question in the classroom. So when I came here, that was kind of a shock for me because like the students were more, I would say, outgoing in terms of raising questions, initiating discussions with peers, and I was like, oh wow, that's something I've never experienced before, right? And also in the classroom, we have this like open discussions. I've always refrained from participating fully because I think my part of my Chinese background told me not to participate or just to stay silent because in China we have this saying, silence is gold, right? And as long as you stay silent, by listening, you will learn a lot. But like here is like the opposite. You need to talk, you need to participate, you need to present yourself to the in front of a class so that you can either gain a participation grade or, kind of assimilate kind of, I would say, American educational philosophy. So I would say here at the beginning it was kind of struggle, but as as time moved on, I began to kind of grapple with this dissonance between my Chinese cultural background and the education philosophy here in the United States. So, and I ended up reconciling my identity with like the education here. So I think so far I'm doing okay, but like it's something I felt interesting to kind of share with the audience.
Yeah, I really appreciate your perspective, Hong, because I guess I didn't realize how the Asian American perspective is actually quite different from the international Asian perspective. So I really appreciate you being on this panel and sharing that with us. But in line with that story, I guess I would like to pose a question to everyone else in that, do you feel like the silence is gold thing also affected the way you participated in school? Or did you feel maybe the need or like the desire to assimilate more into American culture? Like what things from home or from Chinese traditional culture impacted the way you acted in America?
I guess I can start. For background, I grew up in a basically 95% white community. For the entirety of elementary school up until like high school, I'd usually be either 1 or 2 Asian kids in the class. I think looking back on my childhood, I didn't ever really participate a lot in class. I would always try and not really sit in the back, but keep my head down and do my work and not really say anything, stick out. I think a large part was that because I didn't want to stand out, because I felt internally that I already stood out because I was not white, and that just my appearance and my presence in the classroom just made me stood out already. So I didn't want to try and bring attention to myself or try and basically not fit the Asian stereotype of this kid, smart kids who just put their heads down and work.
I have 2 very different experiences. So when I was in China, I've always been a rebellious kid. So when I was in China, I was one of those kids who was very loud, who would always raise their hand when a question was asked, because I just felt like I need to have my voice heard, even at home, outside of the education environment. I would just do the opposite of what my family wants me to do. For example, there's a thing where women can't really spread their legs when they're sitting, only men can do it. And I would do the opposite. I will always fight with my grandma, not actually fighting, but always would do the opposite of what they tell me to do. And so in China, I was actually more outgoing. But once I moved back to the US, under the pressure to assimilate, and also having all eyes on me because I looked very different in my community where I went to school, especially middle school, I actually became more on the silent side. I stopped really speaking up as much because I also had the language barrier at the time too, and just did not want to stand out in general because I didn't want more attention than I was already getting in a way. And so I think it's very interesting how much societal pressure, societal expectations can play a role in one person's development and how they interact with the people, the environment that they're in.
Yeah, I was a very quiet kid growing up. I was the kid where at parent-teacher conferences, my teacher would always tell my parents I was a pleasure to have in class, but I needed to speak up more. And now that I'm looking back on it, I realize it may have come from the idea that I didn't need to speak up because someone else would do it. So I never really saw the point of participating in class if everyone else was just going to participate. And I also didn't feel the need to say things for the sake of saying things, which is a reason why I always justified it to myself. I would never participate in class because, I mean, I don't need to say anything, so why should I?
Well said. There is a question in the chat that I would like to ask. As Asians, do you adhere to the philosophy that some things are better left unsaid?
Oh, I mean, I think that's definitely the case for me. Because I think while I was in one of those classroom discussions, I wanted to challenge like some of the arguments made by my peers and the professors. But after like that was my initial thought, but maybe like seconds after that, I started thinking, well, maybe it's not the best time to raise my questions right now. It's not the best time to challenge them at this moment because it would embarrass them, and I don't want to just make them look embarrassed for the whole class, right? So, and that's why I decided to stay silent and maybe, raise my either objections or questions afterwards. But like, I do definitely identify with, this philosophy, right? And I think some things are definitely, it's better for I would say the coherence in the classroom or in the community that some things are left unsaid.
Okay, so we're rounding out about 6 now. If any of the interns want to add any more concluding remarks, stop me now. And we're good. So my final question is just going to be, what have you guys learned from this internship, and how would you like the perception of Asian Americans to change moving forward? And if everyone could just like give a few sentence answer.
Yeah, I don't mind going first. So one thing I learned in this internship that was really valuable to me, I learned not only like the history and about the like ongoing lives of DC Chinatown, especially as a student at a DC university, but also about the experiences of other young Asian American people, because I had never really been exposed to a group like this where we could all just discuss these issues and like just about being Asian American. I had never really experienced that before, so it was really good to be in an environment like that. And one thing I hope going forward to change about the perception of Asian Americans is for that people to understand that Asian Americans are not a monolith. Everyone's experiences is different, and not everyone fits the stereotype of what people think an Asian American should be.
I guess I can go next. So I guess over the course of this summer, I think this internship has helped me like kind of open my eyes to the like world of Asian American civic advocacy, so to speak. I never really um one like knew about this or thought I would be interested in this sort of sphere of political engagement before starting this internship. But now, like after having discussed issues faced by Asian Americans, sort of the history of Asian America. I went to like a protest in June, the Unity March, and all this is kind of sort of culminating together in a sort of like realization that this is something that I'm interested in and I'm genuinely passionate about. And I have the internship to thank for that. Um, and as for perceptions of Asian Americans, I think it's a pretty simple hope, but for us to be accepted for who we are, we're not perpetual foreigners, we're not outsiders, but we're also not, for lack of a better term, white. Like, I think there's maybe two polar ends of this spectrum of like, you're either like an alien, a foreigner, or you're one of us. And I think we can exist as Americans, um, Asian Americans, but we don't want to have to assimilate to a sort of like maybe larger cultural structure. We want to be able to express our own cultural heritage while being accepted uh, as equal Americans in this country.
I'll go next. I definitely learned a lot from this internship, whether that's the different projects we got to work on, the amount, like the diversity among the projects that we have, that interns had the opportunity to jump into. I learned a lot about the way not only 18E2, but also just how nonprofits function in general, how to put together events, the importance of communication, and just learning different skills along the way too, like graphic designing and stuff like that, things I did not expect to gain from this internship. I definitely learned a lot from the logistics side, but more importantly, I definitely got to learn so many new and different perspectives from this group and also among the 18-2 team. I think it's very special that we formed such a bond where we're able to trust each other and have these kind of conversations weekly in different Zoom meetings. And it was just very nice to know that there is a community to rely on, that we are all fighting for the same causes. And it's very empowering for someone who has been trying to be more of an activist in my community, but always felt very alone in doing it. I think the two things I want to mention in terms of the perception of Asian Americans moving forward, as well as just reconciling with your Asian American identity. I think one thing everyone noted was the diversity among Asian American population, because I think people often forget how diverse our community really is. And when we refer to Asian American communities, we're really covering a wide range of population. So of course, there also comes with a variety of political stances. Asian American is very much an umbrella term that should be used to unify the communities fighting for causes that we share similar struggles with, but we should also recognize and account for the differences amongst our communities as well as our individual differences as well. And so going along the lines of that, I think our individual experiences should be more seen and more talked about, because everyone is going through their own journey in terms of finding themselves, knowing who they really are. And for me personally, I think it's going to be probably a lifelong journey trying to really accept myself for who I am, no matter where I go. It's challenging but fruitful. And so I really want to promote the hope for the younger people like watching this, to not feel discouraged. And I think being biracial before I thought was very much a burden that always really pulled me down, but I'm slowly turning it into an empowering tool, because it's given me such a unique perspective that will allow me to empathize and understand others more. And it's definitely given me a better sense of purpose to serve my community. So I really hope that can eventually be others' empowering tool as well.
Okay, there's been a number of questions that's posted on the chat, and I like to start addressing those questions. So here's one for everyone. I have many young cousins who are biracial, even triracial. Do you have any pressure on who you date or marry? I see smiles out there.
I'll kick this off by saying something that my mom is watching right now. I don't think she'll mind if I say it, but well, she knows that most of the kids that I'm around are Caucasian or not Asian American. So whenever that conversation came up a few years ago, she says, "Just give Asian girls a try." That's what she told. No, I won't say I felt pressure to try. Oh, it sounds terrible, to try a certain ethnicity, but they haven't put any sort of that kind of pressure on me. It's really just a genuine match as a person and all that.
I really hope this is not just in the Asian community, but I think it's all about like familiarity and the ability to relate. And so I think there is a tendency among like every group to want your want your son or daughter to marry someone from their ethnic background, because that way they're able to relate to them more and be able to communicate with them. So I think, I mean, in my case, it's kind of the same thing, but I don't think there's any ill intention or like anything involved like that. Just the hope that they can actually be able to talk to whoever I'm dating.
I'll jump in. My parents have never made me feel like I need to date someone who's Asian, but also my parents are in a multiracial relationship, so I feel like if they did, that would be hypocritical. um, but I think it's nice being able to share cultures and share traditions, like while being in a multiracial relationship. Like my boyfriend is white, and I was the first person to introduce him to rice, and he loves that. So I just think, like, the more interconnection we have in life, it's probably the better.
Okay, next question. What would it take for young Asian Americans to step up as political leaders? Why aren't there more?
I think if that's a question first as to why aren't there more like Asian American leaders right now, it's because like I feel like socially it isn't like socially America like Asians aren't viewed as leaders, period. From media perception, like usually Asian Americans are not depicted in leadership roles or having the main character roles. It's usually just like side character roles, token Asian roles, stuff like that. So already there's that implicit stereotype that we are not, the main spotlight of leadership roles, etc., or in politics. So I think it first comes with a change in perception of American society in general, to show that Asian Americans can and should be leaders. And then from that change in perception, slowly we can not only gain a more stronger political voice and slowly get leaders into Congress or other places.
Right. As a side note, I think it's very interesting in terms of representation in this case, because I can't remember if this was Ronnie Chen or Jimmy O Yang that had a bit basically about, oh, if only there was an Asian president where Asian kids will actually feel like that's a possibility for them to not just be the stereotypes doctor or lawyer. And so I think it's very important that not only do we participate, Asian Americans participate in grassroots movements because they're very essential to making actual changes, but also the fact that we need more people in Congress as well, because I can't remember the exact statistic, but it's definitely not representative in terms of how many Asian Americans we have in Congress versus the actual Asian American population. And so just encouraging the younger ones to at least look into it would be very helpful to, I don't know, to inspire the younger generation to be more politically active in general and feel like that's something that they can do.
Okay, next question. What are some different perspectives that hold between Asian Americans and Asian international students? Are there different views between the two classes?
Speaking as an Asian American, something that's always been really interesting to me, that's kind of seen as a different view between the Asian Americans and just Asian people, not necessarily international students, but Asian people who aren't Asian American, is, interestingly enough, cultural appropriation, I think, is an issue that really shows the divide between the Asian American experience and the Asian experience, because a lot of what I see in incidents of cultural appropriation is Asian people will usually see it as kind of like people engaging in Asian culture as a show of appreciation, and it's not seen as a negative thing or trying to be offensive. And meanwhile, for Asian Americans, cultural appropriation is seen as more often than not disrespectful and like a no. And I think it's really interesting, and I think for me, I think it stems from a difference of a minority versus a majority. For instance, like in America, Asian culture is not, it's not the one practiced by most people. So when Asian Americans try to practice their own culture, it'll be seen as like it's foreign or you should try to assimilate. And then you see someone else doing it, getting praised for it. And that, I think, is what kind of makes cultural appropriation negative for Asian Americans. And meanwhile, in the experiences among Asian people who aren't Asian American, where their culture is the majority, there's never been that pressure to assimilate into a majority culture. So when they see people abroad celebrating it, it seems like more of a celebration. And I think for me, I just think that's an interesting perspective on two different sides of the same issue, where I think there is some clear differences between what Asian Americans see versus what Asian non-Americans see.
Yeah, so speaking from my own experience, I think I would say like the Chinese international community in the US is kind of internally split. So we do have this group of people who are closer to what Helen just described. Like they were like, oh yeah, like we have this, China, like Asian people in the United States who have already become Asian American. Like they were like appropriating our culture. Like they were not real Chinese or Korean or Japanese, right? And they were just they speak English. They have English names, and they don't even practice our customs, right? So they should not be considered the same as us. But we do have another group who actually are allies to, I would say, the Asian American communities in the U.S., right? And because I have friends from China who who participated in those anti-Asian hate protests, right? And they went there with their Asian American friends, and they had their own. They formed like a really strong solidarity, and so I think moving forward, it's important to see that kind of like alliance, like a potential alliance could be formed between these two groups, right? But while acknowledging that there is like a certain group that don't necessarily agree with this alliance, but I think we, as like maybe leaders in the future should strive to kind of make that a reality, right? To see how we can build like a stronger relationship between, like the Asian American communities and maybe the international Asian community, right? So I think that should be like part of the agenda right now, right? Because I can confirm that there there are a lot of allies among the Asian international communities that don't necessarily have a way to kind of communicate their needs or to kind of form this relationship with their counterparts in the Asian American communities.
Okay, here's an interesting one. What advice would you give to the upcoming generations of Asian Americans who are or will be growing up in modern US society?
When I hear this question, I think of my two younger brothers, and what I would want to tell them, considering my own experiences. And I think the advice I would want to give them is that it's okay to, not know who you are and explore all the sides of yourself that maybe you haven't considered before, and that you have every right to be yourself, because I didn't feel that for myself growing up, and I don't want my brothers to have to experience that too. So that's advice I think I would give to all young Asian American people, is that it's okay to question your identity, explore your identity, and then you have the right to identify yourself as an Asian American, no matter what your background growing up is, and no matter what language you speak or the holidays you celebrate.
Okay, along that line, what makes you feel the need to identify as Asian American or Chinese American? Does that feel constraining?
For me, identifying as Chinese American is just acknowledging reality. Right? Obviously, I'm ethnically Chinese. I live in America. To ignore that, I feel it is like to like throw away a part of my life that I could be engaging with, and a part of that life that I could find value and meaning from. One of the people I've been working with in 1882, Stan, I believe he's on the meeting today, but he always tells us the story about how growing up in the Deep South, he sort of rejected his Chinese identity until his 50s. And when he realized that as a Chinese American, it's there's nothing really, I feel like there's like nothing to lose by choosing an identity. I don't feel as if it's constraining. I feel actually that it's kind of like liberating, that you can find solace and comfort in a community. If I didn't actively identify as Chinese American, I don't think um I think it would be a loss, or like me, I guess, like burying some like self-evident part of my person, right? This is just like one part of me. It doesn't define me, but it is something that I engage with, and I find, like I said, comfort and solace in being part of that community.
I agree. I think it's also something that I've always been treated Asian. So some people are confused like on my ethnicity based on the way I look, but for the most of my life, people have assumed that I'm Asian, and I feel like ignore that would be, it just would be ignoring a lot of the things that I heard growing up, or like, for example, the types of snacks I would eat at school and like how people would react to them. It's I feel the need to identify with that, is just because like that's my life. I don't know how to put in any other like more eloquent terms than that. But yeah, I also feel like sometimes with being biracial, I don't necessarily always want to identify with my white identity. And being Asian kind of gives me this other culture, this other place to look to and say, oh, I can also have that. So yeah.
This is a good follow-up question. Has anyone reached out to successful Chinese Americans as mentors or role models outside of your parents? If so, what have you learned? If not, why not? Anyone? Do we have any role models that we look up to from your demographics? And we're not talking K-pop.
I guess I can speak on this. I'm also an intern at the Chinese American Museum in DC, and some of my work there has allowed me to interact with a lot of successful Chinese Americans. I haven't connected them personally as like mentors, but it puts me in connection with a lot of Asian Americans who have made a name for themselves, such as like in podcasting. That's one that we're working on right now. I've also worked with Janelle Wong, who's a professor at University of Maryland, and she does a lot of research about Asian American political, like how they vote and stuff like that. So I look up to her as a role model, but not necessarily because she's Asian American, but more because of the work that she does, which I'm also interested in.
It's a question for Matt. Matt stated that he felt different from his peers in elementary school. What was it that made you feel that way at such an early age? Home, school, peers?
I think I already mentioned this, but I was like one of the only Asian kids, especially in elementary school, and that was very obvious from the moment that like I like first went to elementary school. Even if like I could just see it, right? Like I could see that there's no one else that looked like me. I think also part of it was that made me stood out and feel different was that I have a twin brother, and that obviously being a twin was like already like an abnormality, but I noticed in elementary school especially is that me and my brother would always be confused, even if we weren't in the same class. But what's funny about that was that there's also another set of Caucasian twins, two girls, that I would never ever hear about them being confused by teachers, by other kids. It was always me and my brother who were confused with each other because we're like, even if we are the only two Asian boys, we were always the ones that were confused. So I think it was like at a very young age, I was already like experiencing that's like, I guess not stereotyping, but like that difference of experience of being Asian compared to my peers.
Yeah, and kind of as an interesting aside from what Matt was saying, in middle school, my best friend and my best friend is also Asian. Her family is from Hong Kong. People would always confuse us, even though we weren't related at all. Our only similarity really was that we had dark hair and glasses, and yet our friends, our teachers would always call us by each other's names, which was something that really frustrated us because it felt like no one ever bothered to see us as two separate people. And I will say we did do everything together, but in all honesty, it wasn't that difficult to figure out that we were two separate people. So it always felt kind of like that no one bothered to actually know us and like figure out, like, see the little things that made us separate people.
It's now 6:25. There's a plug here, and I'm going to read it, and this pertains to role models. And I agree with this post. I think Ted Gong, the 1882 Foundation Executive Director, is a fantastic role model. He is not only professional, but very patient and diplomatic. Just being around him is a learning experience. Is Ted on the line? We saw him earlier. Ted, are you there? Is that you, Ted?
Yeah, so that's an embarrassing statement, but I appreciate whoever said that. And I don't know why this is not recording. So if I have any talents at all, it's obviously not anything related to technical skills. But we come to the end of the hour, and one of the things we really love is these opportunities to get together with us as a community, all of you. So I want to thank not just our participants. This every year our cohort of interns and people that participates with us gets bigger and stronger. It is so much a pleasure to meet such wonderful people and hear such thoughtful discussions. And I want to thank Richard this year because it was the first year that he came on board to sort of like shepherd us through the intern program. And Ellen, I know you've done great work with Richard in making this program come together. But I also want to thank all these guys. Stan has been with us from the beginning. This is our 10th year, almost maybe 11th year together, Stan, and doing monthly programmings. And I also want to thank all the people. I recognize many of the people that are online, but it's actually all you guys that we should thank for being here with us, because the Talk Story program especially is designed for us to have an opportunity to share ideas as a community. Unfortunately, we're not really doing it together physically, which is what we're trying to, we need to return back to. Because the idea, as Stan has always said in his introductions and so forth, is this Talk Story is an opportunity for us to come together, share ideas, remember stories. And in that process of sharing and telling stories, then our community is strengthened. So I want to encourage you all to come back with this. Certainly all the interns and of this group and of previous groups are always welcome to come together with us, to work with us, and to build this community as little as you have time for, but as much as you can too. So think of great ideas and working together. I see Stan came online. It's always good to see Stan. And I hope that everyone else, in the past, we've had a thing where we have a hangout room, which we unmuted everybody. And we got people to just chat as much as they can. That idea was to duplicate a sense like after a conference or a gathering, people would just hang around and chat. And I have to say that some of the best conversations were with the group in these unstructured talk story or open mic situations, which reminds me, there's a number of programs that are still coming up this year. We're finalizing a bunch of them. But one thing that I've been working with Harry Chow is something that should be quite exciting for everybody. It's going to be called Muscle Cars, Motorcycles, and Tropical Fish. And what we're going to do is have probably like an open mic session where everybody can talk about those things that occurred in Chinatown you never think of, like how many people really own muscle cars, where did they race them, and then what were tropical fish about. There are big topics in the memories of people who grew up in Chinatown during the 50s and 60s. So that I hope is something that's interesting to you. Richard, I guess we're trying to close out. I don't know if anybody else would like to say a few things. Stan is our
Just very quickly, Ted.
yeah.
We certainly, I thank the 8 interns who spoke up today, and great views, very perspectives, very cogent and deep perspectives on their thought process, and we want to hear your voices, definitely, because you represent our future in our community. And when I listen to you all, I can't help but feel that our future's in great hands with you all. And I do want to acknowledge that you 8 that are here today, but we had 3 other interns, and I want to acknowledge them also. Audrey Sun, Melanie Chu, and Aida Guo. So those were our 11. They made up our cohort this summer, and we appreciate Richard's direction in putting together a great program. And like I said, you all have put together 3 outstanding talk story events in the past month here, and it offered a great views of what our future in our community is going to be like. And when people are saying, why aren't there more political leaders? Well, I think political leaders are going to come from you all, and I'm looking forward to it very much. And the future's in great hands, I think. And I appreciate all that you did, because as Ted said, sharing our stories makes us a stronger community. And I think people will feel empowered by what you have said today and what you've expressed and your opinions that you've given us all and the advice that you've given us. And so we look to you for leadership here. So I want to thank you all for that. It's been my pleasure to have you all this summer with us, and we look forward to your continued association with us as you pursue your careers in college and so forth and so on. So time's running out. So Richard, I'll hand it back over to you to finish it off today. Unmute yourself.
Thank you. What we'll do is thank the interns for a job well done. Excellent year. As Ted said, we welcome you back anytime, open arms. I've learned a lot from you, and hopefully, like I said before, each day was a little smarter than the day before. And I thank you all for your support. So Ellen, what we can do is we can unrecord and open it up for